The radio kept clicking, like someone was squeezing the transmit button with a wet thumb.
No voice came through at first, just the open hiss of the channel. Then there was breathing. Slow and steady, close to the microphone.
We found a line of markers tied to low branches.
These were little strips of white cloth, each one knotted tight around a twig.
They were soaked through and gray with rain, but they hadn't been there long.
The line of cloth led down slope to the creek.
At the water, it stopped, as if whoever tied them had walked straight in.
Elias crouched on the near bank, staring at something caught between two stones.
Mara was local, a woman in her 50s with a face that looked carved by weather.
When I mentioned the white cloth, she told me not to say that too loud.
She looked toward the trees and said, "If you follow it, it starts following you."
We found a blue rain jacket hanging from a branch at eye level.
It was zipped, sleeves hanging straight, hood up. It was as if an invisible man were standing inside it and waiting for us. On that gravel bar stood a tent, pitched perfectly.
The little camp looked organized, almost careful, except there was no reason for it to be there.
We shouted until our throats hurt, but there was no answer. Inside the tent, we found both sleeping bags zipped shut.
On top of one bag was a watch, still ticking.
On the other was a driver's license, placed face up.
A long line of white cloth was tied from trunk to trunk through the woods.
On the far side of it stood Elias, but his face was pale and his eyes held nothing.
The figure kept standing there, wearing Elias's shape badly.
I returned to Graves Creek once after I retired.
Near the unnamed creek, I found a cedar with a healed scar around one low branch. At the water's edge lay 5 smooth stones, but no cloth or bell.
Back at my truck, I found a wet strip of white cloth tied around the door handle. Beneath my windshield wiper, someone had placed 5 small bells in a perfect circle.
They were still trembling, though there was no wind. The woods felt different today, like they were holding their breath. Oren wouldn't go near the water, and I couldn't blame him.
Then, that sound cut through the silence again.
It was just hanging there, like someone had stepped out of it. The map inside was marked with circles that didn't make any sense. It felt like we were being watched by something that wasn't there. The radio clicked 3 times, but nobody was on the other end. Then the dog started whining, looking at something behind us. There was a man standing in the trees, just watching.
I called out, but the figure didn't even flinch.
Ben looked through his binoculars and just went cold. When I looked, the trees were empty again. We found their tent on a gravel bar across the river. It was pitched perfectly, like they were still there. But there were no tracks. No sign of anyone coming or going. Stunned and confused, everything was left behind, just like they'd stepped out for a second. The cook pot was full of stones, all wrapped in white cloth. And under the stones, we found another bell. Then the radio spoke, and it was Aaron's voice. He told us not to let him count us. Lacey dropped the pot, and her dog just took off into the woods. The woods felt like they were folding in on us.
I heard Elias, but he wasn't supposed to be there.
Then I saw it, a line of white cloth stretching through the trees. The figure looked like Elias, but everything about it was wrong.
It just stood there, smiling like it had been waiting for me.
Then a bell rang, right next to my ear.
Say in a natural American voice, quiet and shaken. Lacey was kneeling there, talking to something I couldn't see.
The dog's collar was just lying there, empty. And in the water between the roots, those bells were just turning. Ben lunged forward, grabbing Lacey by the jacket to pull her away. We fought to drag her back as she clawed at the moss. She whispered that Aaron was holding a lantern. I looked, and I saw a young man standing in the shadows, holding a light that cast no glow.
Say in a natural American voice, dread and awe. Behind the man with the lantern, more shapes emerged from the trees. They all had their hands at their sides, listening for the next bell.
We didn't act with bravery. We scrambled like animals.
We were slipping and falling as we retreated from that place.
We stumbled back to the gravel bar, but the tent was gone.
Only the 5 stones remained, arranged in a perfect circle.
In the center of that circle sat Ben's hat.
Ben stood there, bareheaded and silent, staring at the hat.
Whew, we made it back to the road where the rest of the team was waiting.
They told us we had been gone for 4 hours, but it felt like only 20 minutes.
Lacey kept asking about her dog, forgetting the answer as soon as she heard it.
Ben sat on the truck tailgate, rocking back and forth.
When the incident commander asked what we had found, I lied.
I told him we found a campsite and lost the trail due to the weather.
I said the dog had slipped its lead.
It was a lie, but it was the only way to keep the truth from sounding like madness.
The official search continued for 3 more days, but we never found the hikers or the dog.
The tent didn't reappear, and the blue rain jacket vanished from evidence storage.
It was blamed on administrative confusion.
That's a convenient phrase for when nobody wants to admit something impossible had happened.
Elias quit before winter.
Ben eventually crashed his truck after seeing a black dog dragging a strip of white cloth.
Lacey never handled search dogs again.
I stayed, thinking that if I kept filing reports, the land would become ordinary again, but it never did.
Years later, I returned to Graves Creek, telling myself I wanted closure.
The trailhead was quiet, and the sunlight broke through the canopy.
Near the creek, I found a cedar with a healed scar around a branch.
Say in a natural American voice, dread and awe. It was as if something had been tied there long ago, and left just long enough for the tree to remember.
At the water's edge, I found 5 smooth stones, but no cloth and no bells.
I stood there until the light began to thin.
From somewhere upstream, I heard Elias call my old unit number.
He used the same young, afraid voice he had used that day. I didn't answer.
On the way back, I passed a family with a little girl who had a silver bell on her backpack.
I wanted to warn them, but I only said, "Stay on the trail."
That evening, at my truck, I found a wet strip of white cloth tied to my door handle.
And 5 bells in a circle on my windshield, still trembling without a breeze.
The bells were still trembling, even though the air was completely still. It was like the woods were reaching out to remind me I never really left.
I didn't look back at the trees.
I just drove, wanting to put as many miles between me and that creek as possible.
Every time I saw a flash of white in the periphery, I flinched.
My mind kept replaying the sound of those bells, ringing in the dark. I sat in the truck for a long time, listening to the rain tap against the roof.
It was the only sound I wanted to hear. I walked through the rooms, turning on lights, trying to chase away the shadows.
But the forest had a way of following you home, even when you locked the door.
I poured a glass of water, my hands still trembling slightly.
I knew I wouldn't be sleeping tonight.
I sat in my armchair, staring at the fireplace.
I thought about the hikers, about Lacey, and about the bells that never stopped ringing in my head.
The silence of the house was broken by a faint metallic sound. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs.
I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole.
I opened the door, the cold night air rushing in, and saw a single strip of white cloth tied to the porch railing.
I didn't touch it. I just closed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. The forest had found me, and I knew it would never let go.
I sat in the dark, listening to the house settle.
Every creak sounded like a footstep in the woods.
I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting outside.
Then the sound started again.
It was the thin, metallic ring of a bell.
My hand hovered over the deadbolt, but I couldn't turn it. I backed away from the door, my breath itching. I grabbed my old radio, hoping for a signal. The static was pulsing like a heartbeat in the room.
Through the static,
A voice emerged. It sounded exactly like Elias. He was calling my unit number over and over.
I dropped the radio, and it clattered against the floor.
The bells on the porch stopped ringing.
I knew then that I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my keys and ran for the back door.
I burst out into the night, the cold air hitting my face.
The forest was right there, looming over the backyard.
I reached my truck and fumbled with the keys.
I finally got the door open and scrambled inside.
I didn't look back, just started the engine and peeled out.
The road ahead was a blur of shadows and mist.
I drove faster than I should have.
I kept expecting to see something following me.
I didn't stop until I reached the main highway.
The lights of the city gave me a sense of relief. I pulled over and just sat there, trying to process everything. I looked down at my lap and saw something.
A small brass bell was sitting on the passenger seat.
I hadn't brought it with me, but there it was.
I stared at the bell, my heart hammering against my ribs.
It shouldn't have been there, yet it sat waiting for me.
I reached out, but the cold metal made the air feel stagnant. I didn't touch it. I just drove until the city lights faded.
I needed to get back to the station and find some answers.
My hands were shaking, and every shadow looked like a person. The station lot was empty, just a flickering light near the entrance.
I sat there watching the rain turn everything into a gray mess.
I couldn't bring that bell inside, so I left it locked in the truck.
The station smelled like old coffee and wet gear. I walked to my desk and started pulling files from the search. I needed to see the photos again and find what I missed.
The photos were just as I remembered them. But as I flipped through, I noticed something new.
There was a faint, blurred shape near the edge of the trees.
I grabbed a magnifying glass and leaned in closer.
It wasn't a trick of the light or a smudge.
It was a man standing in the shadows, just like the one I saw.
A cold sweat broke out as I realized what it meant.
It had been there the whole time, watching us. I felt an overwhelming urge to get out of the station. I turned to leave, but the radio suddenly crackled to life. It wasn't the usual static. It was the sound of a bell. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, unable to move. The ringing continued, rhythmic and insistent. I slowly turned back toward the radio, my heart pounding. I knew I shouldn't answer, but I couldn't help myself.
I pressed the transmit button, my thumb trembling.
I didn't say anything, just listened to the silence.
Then a voice came through, whispering my own name. The voice on the radio was my own.
It sounded hollow, like it was coming from somewhere else.
I dropped the handset, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I had to get out of there. The station felt like it was closing in on me. I burst out into the cold, pouring rain. My truck was waiting under the light. I walked toward it, my heart pounding. I could see the bell sitting there on the seat. I just stood there in the rain. The bell seemed to be pulling the darkness in. I knew I couldn't just walk away from it. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door swung open with a heavy creak. The smell of the forest hit me instantly. I reached out and touched the cold metal. The ringing stopped the second I grabbed it.
It felt warm, despite the cold rain.
I sat there, holding the bell tight. I didn't even try to start the truck. I felt like the forest was waiting for me. My radio started clicking on the seat. It was the same sound as the bell. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I picked up the radio.
I knew exactly what it wanted from me.
It wanted me to count along with it. I pressed the button and let the bell ring. Everything went quiet for a second.
Then the truck started up on its hums.
The engine turned over, but it sounded like it was choking on something thick. I didn't even touch the gas, but the truck started rolling toward the trees on its own.
I held onto the wheel for dear life as the parking lot disappeared into the fog.
The headlights cut through the dark, and the trees looked like they were leaning in to watch.
The road just disappeared under the tires, replaced by a thick, mossy carpet. The air in here got real thin, and I could feel the forest staring right at me.
The radio started clicking, but then a ringing sound came through the speaker.
It was the exact same rhythm as the bell in my hand. The bell was vibrating against my palm, and it felt like it was talking to the radio.
I hit the brakes, but the truck just kept sliding forward like it was on ice.
The trees opened up to show the creek, and the water looked like black oil.
Those white cloth strips were everywhere, tied to the branches and waving in a wind that wasn't there.
The truck finally stopped, and the engine just died with a rattle. Everything went quiet, and I just sat there for a second.
Then the radio clicked on, and Aaron's voice told me to get out and look at the stones.
I stepped out, and my boots sank right into the mud.
There were 5 dark stones in a perfect circle, all wrapped in white cloth.
It looked like someone had set a trap, and it was just waiting for me.
I knelt down, and my heart was beating out of my chest.
When I reached for a stone, the bell in my pocket rang out loud.
The water started churning, and I saw a hand reaching up from the bottom. I scrambled back, trying to get away from the water as fast as I could. The trees were moving, closing in and blocking the way back to my truck. The bell was ringing so loud now, it felt like it was inside my head. Everything went dead silent, and it was even worse than the noise. I looked up and saw them standing between the trees, just watching me. They weren't doing anything, just waiting for me to make a move. I knew right then that I wasn't getting out of here the same way I came in. The forest was finally coming to collect what it was owed. One of them started walking toward me, and it moved like a broken puppet.
The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm that made my skin crawl.
I tried to back away, but my boots caught on a slick root.
The forest held its breath, and I heard that bell clinking again.
I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the mud soaking through my pants.
I didn't look back. I just ran toward where I thought the truck was.
The trees blurred into a wall of gray and green.
My radio crackled to life, but it wasn't the deputy. It was my own voice, playing back a conversation I hadn't had yet.
I stopped running and stared at the device on my shoulder.
The voice on the radio said, "You're running in circles."
I looked around, and I was back at the same cedar stump.
The white cloth strips were tied to the branches, glowing with a sickly light. I reached out to pull one of the strips down, but my hand stopped. The air felt solid, like a wall of cold glass. I could see the other side, but I couldn't reach it. Then the bells started again, ringing from every direction at once. It was a chaotic, metallic symphony that made my head spin. I fell to my knees, covering my ears, but the sound was inside my head. I looked up and saw the shapes again, standing in a circle around me. They weren't attacking. They were just waiting. One of them held out a small brass bell, tarnished and dented. I didn't take the bell. I stood up, my legs shaking, and backed away. The figures didn't follow. They just watched.
I turned and ran again, needing to get away from that circle.
I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the road.
My truck was there, idling, the headlights cutting through the mist.
I jumped in, slammed the door, and drove as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, miles away.
I pulled over, my hands shaking so hard I could barely turn off the engine.
I looked at the passenger seat, and there was the brass bell.
I stared at the bell on the passenger seat, my heart hammering like a trapped bird.
It shouldn't have been there. Not after I left it miles back in the dark timber.
The metal seemed to pulse with a faint cold light that made the truck feel small.
I reached out to push it away, but my fingers froze just before touching the cold brass.
The radio on my shoulder crackled again, but this time it wasn't static or voices.
It was the sound of a bell ringing, clear and sharp, echoing inside the cab.
I threw the truck into gear and peeled away, tires spinning on the wet asphalt.
I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from the forest.
The road ahead was a blur of rain and darkness, but I kept driving.
In the mirror, I saw something standing on the edge of the road.
It was a figure, tall and thin, watching me pass.
I heard the faint, rhythmic ringing of a bell, growing louder and then fading.
I finally reached the main highway, the lights of a distant town appearing like a beacon.
I pulled into a gas station, my hands still shaking, and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing.
I looked over at the passenger seat, expecting to see the bell, but it was gone.
Just an empty seat. The fabric slightly indented where it had been. I let out a long, shaky breath, trying to convince myself it was all just a nightmare.
I stepped out of the truck, my legs feeling like lead.
The air was cold and smelled of gasoline and damp pavement.
I walked to the edge of the station, looking back toward the dark silhouette of the mountains.
I realized then that I hadn't escaped.
The forest didn't need to follow me. It was already part of me.
Every time I closed my eyes, I would see those white cloth strips, hear those bells, and feel the weight.
I got back into the truck and started the engine.
I didn't look back again.
I drove toward the city, trying to drown out the memory of the bells.
The forest never lets you go.
It just waits for you to stop running, to stop fighting, and to finally listen. And in the end, the only thing left to do is to keep walking and hope you never hear the bell.